Hello, I'm Jeffrey Weinstock from Central Michigan University in Michigan, USA. I want to start by thanking you for inviting me to speak with you today. Hot off the presses, the title of my talk is Love Letters from the Future, the Salvage Sublime. And so that you have something else to look at other than me the whole time, I'll have a few PowerPoint slides available along the way. So let's get going. In Emily St. John Mandel's luminous novel Station 11 from 2014, character Clark Thompson is the self-appointed curator of the Museum of Civilization, a curious assemblage of obsolete objects, quote, taken for granted miracles, as Clark puts it, from before a global pandemic decimated humanity. Housed in the Sky Miles lounge of a defunct airport in Michigan, Clark's collection includes things like a driver's license and a plastic snow globe that no longer makes sense in a world without running cars or factories mass-producing cheap souvenirs and knickknacks. In Clark's eyes, they're things of wonder, calling to mind all that has been lost. In the eyes of those born after the end, they're incomprehensible. Quote, It's hard to explain isn't good enough, so we always try to explain it all anyway, writes Mandel, whenever anyone asks Clark about any of the objects he's collected over the years. From the airport and beyond, the laptops, the iPhones, the radios from an administrative desk, the electric toaster from an airport staff lounge, the turntable and vinyl records that some optimistic scavenger had carried back from Severn City. And of course, the context, the pre-pandemic world that he that he remembered so sharply. The Museum of Civilization in Station 11 is perhaps the most lyrical iteration of now what is a well-worn trope of post-apocalyptic science fiction, repurposed detritus from before the fall. Central to works including Walter M. Miller Jr.'s A Canticle for Leibowitz, Russell Hoban's Ridley Walker, the Mad Max films, Margaret Atwood's Oryx and Crake, Jeff Vandermeer's Bourne, and so on. This theme has three main variants. First, an object we recognize as costly or scarce is repurposed for some quotidian task, so rare books being used to keep a fire going, or a valuable painting being used as wrapping paper. Second, something we recognize as cheap is perceived as occult and becomes the focus of veneration. So, as we'll see, a toilet seat or a shopping list as a source of wonder or occult knowledge. And third, an object is preserved by somebody who recognizes its value in a world that has forgotten it. The use of salvaged objects in post-apocalyptic narratives has primarily been addressed in relation to Evan Calder Williams's concept of salvage punk, a repurposing of objects in an idiosyncratic way that, as distinct from both cyberpunk and steampunk, Williams sees as a form of capitalist critique. As I will develop through this talk, however, such a reading accommodates neither the frequent emphasis on the novelty or sublimity of such objects, nor their tendency to collapse into nostalgia and ultimately capitalist reification for the reader or viewer, if not for the characters. Far more often than not, the break between pre-apocalyptic past and post-apocalyptic narrative present is, in the end, less a profound rupture, opening up the possibility of some reimagined utopian future based on reconfigured social relations, and more an inconvenient and lamentable fissure that will eventually be bridged. And even where the reconstitution of a prelapsarian before seems unlikely, the revaluation of salvaged objects is frequently calculated to evoke either humor or a sense of dismay from the audience at the ignorance or misaligned values of post-apocalyptic survivors. In fact, what we might call post-apocalyptic desire is often linked not only to an edgy aesthetic, which remains its most recognizable feature, but also to a desire to transcend one's class position and to be able to accumulate conventionally valuable objects without selling one's labor power. Such works are thus ironic fairy tales not of the end of capitalism, but of a reconfigured bourgeoisie, not rags to riches, but rags as riches, thereby proving the oft-cited assertion variously attributed to Frederick Jameson and Slavoj Žižek that it's easier to imagine the end of the world than an end to capitalism. Even after the end, after the apocalyptic catastrophe, the scattered pieces of the world slowly reassemble themselves into a debased facsimile of the before, proving that there is just no escaping what Mark Fisher refers to as capitalist realism. This section is called Salvage Punk. To understand why salvage punk tends to implode under its own weight and collapse back into capitalist reification, it's necessary to start with Williams's proposal concerning the punkness of salvage punk. In his 2011 book, Combined and Uneven Apocalypse, William introduces the concept of salvage punk as the, quote, post-apocalyptic vision of a broken and dead world, strewn with both the dream residue and real junk of the world that was, and shot through with the hard work of salvaging, repurposing, detorning, and scrapping, unquote. Williams's examples of salvage punk range widely and include everything from the Mad Max films, Chris Marker's La Jetée, and Terry Gilliam's 12 Monkeys, which is based on it, the new Crabuzon novels of China Miéville, Richard Lester's film The Bed Sitting Room, and we can go on and on from there. He gives quite an extensive list, ending with Andrew Stanton's 2008 animated film WALL-E. Although related to both steampunk and cyberpunk, the radical political orientation of salvage punk for Williams differentiates it from both. Steampunk, according to Williams, simply reinscribes capitalism, quote, according to a different, kinder industrial trajectory. It's a, quote, romanticized do-over that remembers an era that never was, back when life was simpler and labor was meaningful, unquote. Quote, keep the technology, keep consumption, but make it thoughtful, writes Williams of steampunk. Cyberpunk, in contrast, presents us with a, quote, cooler, nastier vision of the world we know, and is, quote, the dream image of the neoliberal world par excellence, albeit a sharp-edged one, able at moments to turn back on itself and foreground the nightmare of a deregulated corporate world order. In contrast to both, salvage punk, as explained by Williams, adopts an antagonistic stance in relation to late 20th and 21st century neoliberal capitalism. Not merely a gritty aesthetic, the punk part of salvage punk's post-apocalyptic futures is its adoption of punk's, quote, no future for you mantra as a reflection of our present. Salvage punk recognizes that our world is now already, quote, irrevocably structured as apocalyptic wasteland. Hence, salvage punk says, quote, it's already been burnt, already lost at sea. We came too late. There is no reward and definitely no one there to pay for it. And we can only begin again from here if we finish wrecking, in thought, what we know to be wreckage, yet which refuses to call itself such, unquote. Put directly, salvage punk post-apocalypticism is concerned with being more apocalyptic than the apocalypse, clearing away the clutter to reveal the true hidden-in-play view, namely the deep permanent antagonisms on which capitalism runs and the untenability of that system's capability or capacity to still run, unquote. What salvage punk thus salvages and recasts is the history of our present without a future. And it does so by repurposing waste and detritus, by realizing, quote, the eccentricity of discarded, outmoded, and forgotten things still marked by the peculiar imprint of their time of production and the store of labor and energy frozen in their form, a form from which all value has supposedly been lost, unquote. Salvage punk, William concludes, quote, is the attempt to use the historical shards of antagonism and solidarity in the same way that we might sort, sever, detangle, and grasp objects of insistent value from the wasteland, unquote. This next section is called Wonder. This, to me, is a surprisingly hopeful appraisal of post-apocalyptic narrative, one that emphasizes the revelatory aspect inherent in the notion of apocalypse by unveiling the catastrophic consequences of capitalism for human relations in the natural world. Williams is interested in what he refers to as capitalist apocalypse. Quote, the possibility of grasping how the global economic order and its social relations depend upon the production and exploitation of the undifferentiated, of those things which cannot be included in the realm of the openly visible without rupturing the very oppositions that make the whole enterprise move forward, unquote. Among the undifferentiated, Williams includes zones of famine, and sickness, war zones, class antagonism, climate change, and natural disasters. In short, quote, everything that's worth a damn, yet which does not produce value, unquote. But I think it's reasonable to stop and ask, does post-apocalyptic narrative actually function in this way? And the answer, it seems to me, is mostly no. It is true that, as Zach Bronson writes regarding China Miéville's novels in general, and Miéville's Railsea from 2012 in particular, they, quote, draw on present-day disasters to locate the future as the fulfillment of today's rotting promises, unquote. I disagree, however, with Bronson that salvage punk, quote, envisions the utopian possibilities of recreating the world anew by capturing what Fredric Jameson refers to as the radical break, unquote. Utopian narratives, writes Bronson, now glossing Jameson, quote, do not function by providing portraits of life after capitalism, but by helping us to imagine the necessary break, unquote. Bronson, now taking after Williams, sees this as an attitude of salvage punk, which exposes, quote, the present as broken beyond repair, unquote. With Williams, Bronson sees salvage punk as presenting both a dystopian future and the, quote, utopian possibilities of envisioning the world anew and of thinking outside of this present impasse, principally by imagining Jameson's discussion of the radical break, unquote. As part of this imagining, objects are repurposed, given new meanings in light of their present usefulness, and revalued based on their, quote, social function within the new landscape, unquote. But again, we can ask, are they really? Do they actually do this? While it's sometimes true in post-apocalyptic narrative that prelapsarian objects are scavenged, combined, repurposed, and detorned, I would propose that far more commonly they're presented in two modes, the comic and the nostalgic, that each undercuts the revolutionary potential of post-apocalyptic salvage punk by bridging the gap between post-apocalyptic future and our present and reifying capitalist commodities. The comic mode itself functions in two respects, each relying upon ironic inversion. In the first case, an object that we recognize as costly or scarce is devalued or disregarded. In the second case, something we recognize as cheap or tacky is perceived as mysterious and beautiful and becomes the focus of veneration. In each case, the reader or viewer's knowledge that the true provenance or value of the object introduces a contrast between present systems evaluation and the mistaken or lamentable future comprehension, thus reconfirming present superiority. The disregarding of present value and quotidian repurposing of costly or scarce objects in post-apocalyptic narrative is generally introduced as a gag. One could make the argument, for example, that this is the case in Roland Emmerich's The Day After Tomorrow, as survivors, to fend off intense cold, are forced to burn books from the New York Library. This doesn't quite work as the survivors do so grudgingly, acknowledging the value of that which they are forced to destroy in order to survive. Closer is the first part of the 2019 post-apocalyptic zombie comedy film, Zombieland Double Tap, in which survivors Tallahassee, Columbus, Wichita, and Little Rock play house in the White House in Washington, D.C., and Columbus intends to propose to Wichita using the Hope Diamond, taken from the Smithsonian Museum of Natural History. Much of the humor of this section of the film is derived from the cavalier way in which the group treats valuable and historically significant artifacts, casually appropriating or defacing them for their own amusement, as when they ride scooters through the hallways of the White House, break furniture while playing dodgeball, or use the portrait of President William Howard Taft, 27th President of the United States, as wrapping paper for a Christmas present. The characters' irreverent actions function for viewers as a kind of vicarious wish fulfillment, as they embrace living in the White House with childlike exuberance, playfully debating who should be president, and eschewing entirely the kind of formality or reverence the audience understands the location and its furnishings should be afforded. Laughter is evoked by the surprising inversion of value, but it depends upon the audience's awareness of the significance of the White House and its furnishings in the first place. An even better example of the comic devaluation of an object in post-apocalyptic narrative comes early in the animated film WALL-E, as our hapless robot discovers a diamond ring in a purple velvet box, only to toss away the ring and keep the box. WALL-E here is entirely naive as to the value of the precious gem, which he casually discards as uninteresting. Even more so than Zombieland, even more so than the characters in the White House in Zombieland Double Tap, WALL-E's presented as a child, one that scavenges bric-a-brac that catches his eye from the trash heap that the Earth has become. The viewer, however, is intended to comprehend WALL-E's system of value as uninformed. Because we're not children like WALL-E, alone and unschooled, we know that it is the diamond that is valuable rather than the box that contains it. Part of our dismay or lamentation over the environmental despoilation foregrounded by the film is therefore imbricated with the undermining of a familiar system of value. Part of the problem with post-apocalyptic futures is that valuable objects are not recognized as such. More central to post-apocalyptic narrative is the reverse form of comic inversion, in which cheap or profane objects are regarded as occult or sublime. This transvaluation is the defining conceit of David Macaulay's wonderful book Motel of the Mysteries, as well as central to Walter M. Miller Jr.'s more famous novel A Canticle for Leibowitz. The premise of Motel of the Mysteries is that future archaeologists are excavating a motel buried for centuries after an apocalyptic event in 1985. As Alyssa Rosenberg explains in her review of the book for the Washington Post, the fun of the book is the archaeologists' attempt to interpret the significance of the mysterious objects they uncover. Quote, in some cases, they get certain things right, but for the wrong reasons. Carson, the lead archaeologist, for example, becomes convinced that the motel's television is an altar and was the subject of intense worship by the inhabitants of the room. And, other times, he and his colleagues are disastrously comically wrong, turning toothbrushes into ceremonial earrings and the paper seals on toilets into important documents. Nowhere is this confusion regarding value more evident than in the regard afforded by the excavation team to the toilet seat and the toilet. In one image, an associate on the dig adorns herself with the sacred collar, which is the toilet seat, and matching sanitized for your protection headband. Completing the absurd ensemble are the magnificent plasticus ear ornaments, toothbrushes, and exquisite silver chain and pendant, the sink stopper. In another scene, the head archaeologist Carson, so overwhelmed by the enthusiastic response of viewers to a display of his discoveries, quote, spontaneously remove the sacred collar and ceremonial headband from their respective cases, put them on, and perform the ritual chant of the ranking celebrant into the sacred urn, unquote. Of course, we as readers are intended to understand Carson and his team's mistaken interpretations and to chuckle at their mistaken attribution of value to profane objects. We know better. Based on a similar premise is the first section of Miller's A Canticle for Leibowitz, set in the 26th century after 20th century civilization has been destroyed by a global nuclear war. A religious novice keeping vigil in the desert discovers an ancient fallout shelter containing inscrutable relics, including some attributed to the order's founder, the eventual saint Leibowitz, that readers recognize as technical blueprints and a shopping list. The documents discovered, on which we learn the monks spend years in translation and interpretation, even producing an illuminated manuscript version of one, are eventually connected to Leibowitz's canonization as a saint. A Canticle for Leibowitz is itself part of a post-apocalyptic narrative subgenre in which misinterpreted prelapsarian documents are afforded undue veneration and even form the basis for a culture or religion. Other examples include works such as John Borman's 1974 film Zardoz, with its memorable Sean Connery outfit, with its emphasis on L. Frank Baum's The Wonderful Wizard of Oz, Will Self's 2006 novel The Book of Dave, in which the rantings of an angry taxi driver direct a future misogynistic religion, and Washburn's 2012 play Mr. Burns, a post-electric play, which cleverly foregrounds the cultural significance of the long-running animated program The Simpsons, and in a somewhat different capacity, Dean Parisot's 1999 film Galaxy Quest, in which an alien race mistakes a space opera television series for reality. While such works can certainly form the basis for cultural critique, implicitly calling into question the reverence afforded to sacred texts, enjoyment of them nevertheless turns on appreciating the future misunderstanding of contemporary works. It's true that, especially where material objects are concerned, there is a sense in which defamiliarization, at least initially, allows readers and viewers to abstract objects from economies of exchange and consumption and to appreciate the objects anew. Macaulay's comic emphasis on the occult properties of the toilet seat in particular called to mind Marcel Duchamp's artistic provocation Fountain from 1917. Consisting of a porcelain urinal on a plinth and signed R. Mutt. The work, together with other ready-mades, which were prefabricated, often mass-produced objects separated from their intended use and presented as aesthetic objects, the work and other ready-mades were intended to challenge ideas of art. Is it possible to bracket off knowledge of the urinal's purpose, for example, asks Duchamp, and to appreciate it as an aesthetic object? Duchamp's canny questioning, however, is mostly absent from post-apocalyptic revaluation of objects that foreground comic or occasionally tragic misinterpretation. While it is certainly possible to ask why toothbrushes can't be worn as earrings, or why shopping lists shouldn't be considered as found poems, the intent of The Motel of the Mysteries, A Canticle for Leibowitz, and other such works is to elicit laughter through the contrast of a mistaken future state of affairs with our current understanding of the present. Put simply, post-apocalyptic future societies are defined by their ignorance of correct value. Okay, this next section is called Loss. Narratives of post-apocalyptic inversion in which valuable objects are debased or cheap commodities venerated do little, I would suggest, to foster awareness of capitalist apocalypse. Indeed, I would argue they do exactly the reverse. They reconfirm the superiority of neoliberal capitalism by contrasting the rightness of our valuation of things with the mistaken appreciation of such things in a future that has forgotten how to properly evaluate something's worth. Such works might evoke what we could consider future nostalgia, a longing for the time when the values we assign to different things were generally stable, understood, and shared. And this future nostalgia then plays into the reaffirmation of the present capitalist economy by associating the post-apocalyptic system of value with primitivism, tribalism, and violence. Some post-apocalyptic works play this nostalgia straight. That is, through a clear contrast between an inhospitable, desolate future and a comfortable present. Through this contrast, they ask us to appreciate the luxuries and level of comfort affluent 21st century citizens enjoy. Emily Mandel's Station 11 is exemplary in this respect, particularly with its litany of loss. In the book's 6th short chapter, Mandel presents us with a, quote, incomplete list. And while it's worth quoting in full, I'm going to truncate it here for reasons of time. No more diving into pools of chlorinated water lit green from below. No more ball games played out under floodlights. No more porch lights with moths fluttering on summer nights. No more trains running under the surface of cities on the dazzling power of the electric third rail. No more cities. No more films, except rarely, except with the generator drowning out half the dialogue. And only then, for the first little while, until the fuel for the generators ran out, because automobile gas goes stale after 2 or 3 years. Aviation gas lasts longer, but it was difficult to come by. No more screens shining in the half-light as people raise their phones above the crowd to take pictures of concert dates. No more concert stages lit by candy-colored halogens. No more electronica, punk, electric guitars. No more pharmaceuticals. No more certainty of surviving a scratch on one's hand, a cut on a finger while chopping vegetables for dinner, a dog bite. No more internet. No more social media. No more scrolling through litanies of dreams and nervous hopes and photographs of lunches, cries for help, and expressions of contentment, and relationship status updates with heart icons, whole or broken. Plans to meet up later, pleas, complaints, desires, pictures of babies dressed as bears or peppers for Halloween. No more reading and commenting on the lives of others, and in so doing, feeling slightly less alone in the room. No more avatars. This poignant catalog of no mores reflects all the things that affluent modern citizens currently enjoy that are then lost in the novel's the aftermath of the Georgia flu that decimates humanity. And the novel's somewhat mawkish lesson is that we shouldn't take these things for granted. Indeed, Mandel's privileged strategy to convey her point about just how much, not we in general, but affluent modern citizens enjoy, is the list. The description of Clark Thompson's Museum of Civilization in the Michigan airport is less a salvage yard than a shopping mall or Amazon.com homepage. So now we're over to Clark. There seemed to be a limitless number of objects in the world that had no practical use, but that people wanted to preserve. Cell phones with their delicate buttons, iPads, Tyler's Nintendo console, a selection of laptops. There were a number of impractical shoes, stilettos mostly, beautiful and strange. There were 3 car engines in a row, cleaned and polished. A motorcycle composed mostly of gleaming chrome. Traders brought things for Clark sometimes, objects of no real value that they knew he would like. Magazines and newspapers, a stamp collection, coins. There were passports or the driver's licenses or sometimes the credit cards of people who had lived at the airport and then died. Clark kept impeccable records, unquote. Through these lists of no mores, Station 11 ends up not as capitalist critique, but rather a future elegy for capitalism. Capitalism that, by the way, is restoring itself by the end of the novel as newspapers and electricity are being reestablished. With a focus on the role of Shakespeare in Mandel's novel, Mark West, using Williams's notion of salvage punk, describes Station 11 as a kind of failed apocalypse in the sense of catastrophe without revelation. Quote, the post-apocalypticism most common in Station 11, writes West, quote, works to redeem the pre-apocalyptic world, unquote. The novel, West continues, quote, shows an end without revelation, one that ignores what the collapse that occasions the character Miranda's reflection suggests, that we're already living in apocalyptic times due to the contemporary forms of the capitalist world system, which began with the Anthropocene, which Mandel acknowledges through her use of Shakespeare, unquote. Shakespeare is central both to Station 11 and West's argument, because Mandel uses Shakespeare in his familiar role as avatar of artistic achievement. In the post-apocalyptic future, an itinerant theatrical troupe called the Traveling Symphony performs Shakespeare to small but appreciative audiences still able to find meaning and magic in the Elizabethan plays. For West, Shakespeare's plays, quote, time-stamp the Anthropocene epoch, unquote, and could have been used to call attention to, quote, global trade networks and the ways in which the novel's apocalyptic pandemic scenario is entangled with global capitalism. The novel, however, evades this realization, instead preferring to think of art as both ahistorical and universal. Most importantly, though, the continued appreciation of Shakespeare in Station 11 and the fetishization and universalization of art marks a continuation of Western capitalist valuation that undercuts any form of capitalist critique. Station 11 in this respect is emblematic of the last subcategory of post-apocalyptic narrative salvaging that I will address, the appropriation or saving of valuable art. In Station 11, the Traveling Symphony performs Shakespeare to appreciative audiences. In Alfonso Cuarón's 2006 film Children of Men, the wealthy character Nigel is a government official who runs the Arc of the Arts program, which rescues great works of art, and who has a Pablo Picasso painting, Guernica, hanging in his impressive dining room. In Alan Moore and David Lloyd's graphic novel V for Vendetta, and in its 2005 cinematic adaptation, the home of the anarchist revolutionary V, referred to as the Shadow Gallery, is filled with forbidden works of art and literature. In Ray Bradbury's post-apocalyptic short story The Smile, the miserable survivors show their hatred for the past by ritualistically spitting on Leonardo da Vinci's Mona Lisa, until a young boy, Tom, with a natural affinity for the beautiful and unschooled in hate, blurts out naive praise for the painting. As the feral crowd tears the painting to pieces, Tom is able to salvage the smile, which he keeps close to his heart. In these works and others, the appreciation of classic art is the preeminent marker of being civilized, and its destruction signals the barbarity of a post-apocalyptic future that lacks the ability to correctly appreciate and value artistry and beauty. Although the salvaged works are sometimes displayed, as in Children of Men, as testament to the wealth and power of the possessor who can indulge a taste for art while the rest of the world is struggling to survive, the works themselves, whether artistic, literary, philosophical, or musical, are invariably Western and almost always by white men, and they're presumed to retain an intrinsic and universal appeal for those with natural good taste and sensibility. In the post-apocalyptic future, therefore, as in our present, the fetishization of great art as intrinsically valuable and universally appealing to those with the requisite sensibilities to appreciate it serves to obscure rather than reveal how, as William puts it, quote, the global economic order and its social relations depend upon the production and exploitation of the undifferentiated, of those things which cannot be included in the realm of the openly visible without rupturing the very oppositions that make the whole enterprise move forward, unquote. Put differently, the role of classic art in such narratives is to serve as a bridge between narrative past and narrative present that allows for the continuation of present day in our world neoliberal values which are naturalized as universal and obvious. And this last short section is called No Future. In Mark Fisher's Capitalist Realism, Is There No Alternative?, Fisher outlines what he refers to as capitalist realism. Quote, the widespread sense that not only is capitalism the only viable political and economic system, but also that it is now impossible even to imagine a coherent alternative to it. Unquote. The essence of capitalist realism, according to Fisher, is captured in the assertion, whether from Jameson or Zizek, that it's, quote, easier to imagine an end to the world than an end to capitalism, unquote. Evan Calder Williams's 2011 Combined and Uneven Apocalypse would seem to take issue with Fisher's proposition through the defining of salvage punk as a form of critical theory. And there is no doubt that post-apocalyptic narratives can function as forms of cultural critique, foregrounding, for example, the dangers of nuclear weapons, climate change, and unregulated rapacious capitalism. Nevertheless, such works mostly suffer from a failure of imagination or courage, paying lip service to cultural critique in some obvious way, such as nuclear war is bad or climate change is terrible, while simultaneously reveling in a cool, gritty aesthetic, re-fetishizing commodities, rewarding the audience for a correct comprehension of true value, and confirming the cultural superiority of our present moment, in contrast to the uncivilized, ignorant, coarse barbarians of the future. While we're sometimes asked to acknowledge our present implication in our future destruction, we're nevertheless also overwhelmed by the no mores. Such works are, as Mandel puts it in relation to Station 11, a, quote, love letter to the modern world written in the form of a requiem, unquote. As such, the majority of post-apocalyptic works ironically end up realizing the no future punk mantra by giving us a future that is simply a repetition of the present rather than a rupture or break that would introduce the possibility of change. And that concludes my presentation. Thank you very, very much again for inviting me and for your attention. And do feel free to contact me should you have any questions that you would like to pose. My email address is my name, jeffrey.weinstock @cmichcmish.edu.